66 years old, and if someone had told me 3 years ago that the Lakeside Inn I'd spent 22 years building from a condemned farmhouse in Prince Edward County would nearly end up in the hands of a man I barely knew, and three grown strangers who'd never once picked up a paintbrush or shoveled a driveway in their lives, I would have told them they were out of their mind. But that is exactly what almost happened. And the reason I still have my property, my business, and my name above the door is because when I married Garrett, I made one decision that felt dishonest at the time and turned out to be the wisest thing I've ever done. I never told him, or his children, that the inn was mine. Let me go back. My name is Ruth. I grew up in Belleville, Ontario, one of four kids in a house where nobody had much, but nobody complained about it either. I married young, 23, to a man I thought I loved, and we had a daughter together. Her name is Claire. She was 4 years old when her father and I separated, and I won't spend much time on that chapter because it doesn't deserve it. What matters is that I was alone at 27, with a little girl, a part-time job at a real estate office, and a very clear understanding that no one was coming to save me. I worked that real estate job for 11 years. I got my license, then my broker's license. I saved. I was careful in a way that people who've never had nothing can't really understand. Not cheap, just careful. Every dollar had a purpose. By the time Claire was starting high school, I had enough saved to make a move. The property I bought was a wreck. 110 acres outside of Picton, right on the shore of Lake Ontario, with an 1890s farmhouse that hadn't been lived in properly since the 1970s. The roof sagged. The floors buckled. The real estate agent who showed it to me, a young man who barely masked his condescension, told me it was a project for someone with deep pockets and a long runway. I offered him a polite smile and put in my bid that afternoon. People thought I was crazy. My mother asked me 3 times if I was sure. My brother drove out to look at it, and then drove back to Belleville without saying a word, which I took as his version of a verdict. But I'd walked every inch of that property. I'd stood at the back field, where it dropped down to the water, and watched the light come off the lake in the late afternoon. I knew what it could be. I just needed to be the one to make it. I moved in with Claire and a borrowed truck full of tools I barely knew how to use. We spent the first winter in 2 rooms with a space heater while I gutted and rebuilt the rest. Claire helped. She was 14 and could swing a hammer better than most adults by the time spring came. She didn't always love it. There were nights she was furious with me, teenage fury about living in a construction site, about not being normal. But she also understood, even then, that something real was being built. By the time Claire left for university at Queen's in Kingston, I had 5 guest rooms open and bookings coming in through word of mouth. I called it Lakeshore House. Nothing fancy about the name. I've never been precious about branding. But the experience I gave people was something else entirely. Handmade quilts. Breakfast cooked from scratch every morning. A fire on the water in the evenings for guests who wanted it. The kind of place that makes people feel like they've been let in on a secret. Over the next 15 years, I added 8 more rooms in a converted barn, a licensed dining room that seated 36, and a small event space I rented for weddings and anniversary dinners. I hired staff. I got written up in Toronto Life and later in Condé Nast Traveller as one of the best boutique inns in Ontario. I got a mention in a New York Times travel piece that brought in American guests for 3 solid years. The property, by the time all of this happened, was worth somewhere between $4 and $5 million. The business itself, the brand, the bookings, the reputation, was worth more than I could put a clean number to. I wasn't wealthy in the way that word gets used in Toronto to mean a certain postal code and a certain kind of car. But I had built something real. Something that started with a condemned farmhouse and 22 years of decisions I had to live with every single day. Do you know what it takes to run a property like that through a Canadian winter? To deal with frozen pipes at 5 in the morning and still have breakfast on the table for your guests at 8. To negotiate with suppliers and manage staff and keep your reviews above 4.8 while also being the one who shovels the front path. Claire knew. She'd watched her whole life. By the time I met Garrett, she was 37, working as an architect in Ottawa, and more protective of Lakeshore House than I was. I met Garrett at a hospitality conference in Ottawa in the autumn. He was 69, recently retired from a career in commercial real estate development in Vancouver. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of easy confidence that comes from decades of being the most comfortable person in any room. He'd attended the conference, he said, because he was thinking of investing in rural tourism properties. He approached my booth. I was presenting on the resurgence of rural inn tourism in eastern Ontario. And he asked smart questions, not the showy kind of questions people ask to seem impressive. Actual good questions, I noticed. We had dinner that night with a group of other conference attendees. Then just the two of us the following evening. He was funny and curious, and he listened, which is rarer than people pretend it is. He'd been widowed 2 years earlier. His wife, of 31 years, had died of cancer. He talked about her with real grief, not performance. I respected that. We kept in touch. He came to visit Lakeshore House in the spring, then again in the summer. By the following autumn, we were talking about the future, in the way people do when they've decided something without quite saying it yet. I want to be honest about something. I was lonely. Not desperate, not falling apart. I want to be clear about that. But lonely in the particular way of a person who has built a full and meaningful life and finds themselves wanting to share it with someone. Claire had her own life. My staff were wonderful, but they weren't companions. I'd given my 30s and 40s and most of my 50s to building something. At 63, with the thing built, I found I wanted someone to have a glass of wine with at the end of the night. Garrett seemed like that person. What I didn't expect was his children. He had 3, a son named Derek, who worked in finance in Calgary, a daughter named Pauline, who was a property developer in Vancouver. I noted this, her being a property developer, and filed it away, and the younger son named Wesley, 34, who did something in technology that shifted every time I asked him to explain it. They all came to visit together in early December, 4 months before the wedding. Garrett had told me they were eager to meet me. He said it with real warmth, like a father who believes in his children. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in 2 rental cars. I had rooms prepared, a fire going, dinner planned. I wanted them to feel welcomed. I'd gone to considerable effort. Pauline walked through the inn like she was pricing it. I don't know how else to describe it. She paused in doorways. She looked up at ceilings. She asked how old the converted barn was and whether it had ever been assessed for commercial structural compliance. I said it had been assessed multiple times and was in excellent condition. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not actually agreeing with you. Derek sat down with me after dinner and asked about the business. Not in a getting-to-know-you way, in a numbers way. What was the annual revenue? What did I pay in property tax? Did I have a business loan? And if so, with which lender? I told him we were doing well, that the business was healthy, that I'd rather not discuss specific financials with someone I'd just met. He smiled and said, of course, he was just curious because his father spoke so highly of the property and he cared about his dad's security in retirement. I let that one settle for a moment. Wesley was subtler. He came up to me after breakfast the next morning with his coffee and started talking about digital marketing for boutique hospitality businesses. He had, he said, some experience in that space. He'd love to help me update the website, build out my direct booking funnel, maybe run some paid advertising. Family discount. He said that twice. Family discount. I smiled and thanked him and said I'd think about it. That evening, when Garrett and I were alone, I told him I'd found some of their questions a little forward. He squeezed my hand. He said they were just protective. They'd watched him grieve their mother, and they wanted to make sure he was going to be okay. I understood that, I said, but asking about my business loan on day 1 wasn't protectiveness. It was something else. He said I was being a little sensitive, and I let it drop because I didn't have the evidence yet to be more than uneasy. My daughter Claire visited the following week. She'd heard about the children's visit from me on the phone, and she came up from Ottawa with what I recognized as her project face, the expression she wears when she's assessed a situation and arrived at a structural conclusion. We walked the grounds in the cold, both of us in heavy coats, and she said, "Mom, those kids were appraising the property." "I know," I said. "Did you get a prenup?" I told her that my lawyer, Susan, who I'd worked with since my real estate days and who had done every business contract for Lakeshore House since the beginning, had drafted one, that Garrett had signed it, that it was clear everything acquired before the marriage remained my separate property. The inn, the land, the business, all of it. Claire stopped walking and looked at me. "Okay, good. But Mum, please tell me you haven't told them it's all yours outright. That it's just in your name, no partners, nothing complicated." I hadn't, actually. Not by design, not yet. But I realized in that moment, standing in the cold with my daughter looking at me, that I'd been vague with Garrett about the ownership structure. I'd said things like the property and the business without ever specifying that I was the sole owner, that there was no family trust, no silent partner, no co-investor from the early days. I'd let their assumptions sit uncorrected. I made a decision that afternoon. I would let it stay that way. I would let them believe the ownership structure was complicated, layered, possibly involving other parties. I would be vague and pleasant and not technically lie. Just not correct the misunderstanding I hadn't created but wasn't about to fix. Some people reading this will say that wasn't honest. I've thought about it. What I'll say is that I'd spent 22 years making sure that property survived. I'd survived a market crash and a flood in 2013 that took out the lower guest rooms and a pandemic that nearly destroyed the whole industry. I did not build what I built by ignoring the instincts that kept me alive, and my instincts were telling me something was wrong. We married in May. Small ceremony at the inn. 30 guests, all close friends and family. Claire stood with me. It was a beautiful day, genuinely beautiful. The lilacs were blooming along the east fence, and the lake was flat and blue. When I walked through the ceremony, under that sky with the property I'd built around me, I felt something real. Whatever happened after, that moment was true. Garrett moved in. He brought his furniture, which I fit around mine, his books, his golf equipment, his good scotch. We settled into something that, for a while, resembled the companionship I'd been looking for. He was good company. He cooked dinner on the nights I was too tired. He walked the grounds in the evenings. He was kind to my staff in a genuine way. He seemed to genuinely love the property. Looking back, I can see that was the problem. In the second year, it started. Derek called Garrett more often than felt casual, and whenever I walked into a room and Garrett was on the phone, there was a brief pause before the conversation adjusted. I noticed. I'm someone who has run a business for 2 decades. I notice everything. Pauline came to visit alone in October and asked if she could tour the event space because she was thinking about recommending it to a client for a corporate retreat. I gave her the tour. She spent more time looking at the structure of the barn than any client consideration would require. She asked who held the deed to the converted barn separately from the main house. I said it was all one property. She asked if I'd ever considered formalizing a separate legal entity for the event business for liability purposes. I said my lawyer handled all of that. Then Garrett started bringing me things to sign. The first was a form to update his listed beneficiary on a life insurance policy he'd held since his first career. Routine enough. I read it, signed it. 2 weeks later, another document, a spousal authorization form, he said, for a joint line of credit he wanted to open for household expenses. I read every word. The line of credit would be secured against the property. I put the pen down. Garrett, this with attached debt to Lakeshore House. I'm not doing that. He looked hurt. It's a line of credit, Ruth, for emergencies. We're married. What's mine is yours. What's mine is mine, I said, and I'm not signing anything that puts a lien on this property. He was cold toward me for a week, then warm again. Then another document appeared, a property management authorization, he said, so that he could handle vendor contracts while I was away at conferences. I read it 3 times. It gave him legal authority to enter into financial agreements on behalf of the property, I put it in my desk drawer and said I needed to talk to my lawyer first. I called Susan that night. Susan was quiet for a moment after I finished explaining. Then she said, "Ruth, I want to pull the county records, just to check. I'll call you in a few days." She called in 4 days. Her voice was measured in that way it gets when she's choosing words carefully. Someone has filed a spousal interest declaration against the property. It's a legal mechanism in Ontario that gives a spouse the right to be consulted on certain property transactions. On its own, it's not catastrophic, but the filing was done without your knowledge or consent, and the accompanying documentation overstates Garrett's contribution to the property in a way that's factually incorrect. There's also an application for a joint business registration filed with the province, listing Garrett as co-owner of the operating business. I sat down on the floor of my office, the wooden floor I'd laid myself in 2009. Can he do that? He filed it. Whether it holds is another matter entirely. But Ruth, you need to know, this is not a man who got confused about paperwork. I called my old contact, the due diligence investigator named Paul, who I'd worked with during a complicated property deal years before. "Paul," I said, "I need you to look into someone. His name is Garrett. Everything, financial history, his late wife, her estate, anything that went sideways." Paul came back to me in 10 days with a folder I wish I'd had before the wedding. Garrett's late wife had been a successful woman. She'd owned a catering company in North Vancouver that she'd built over 25 years. In the last 18 months of her life, she'd had breast cancer, stage 4, died most late. She had transferred the business and her personal investment accounts into a joint holding structure with Garrett. Her sister had contacted a lawyer after the death, claiming that the transfers had happened when Garrett's wife was on heavy medication and not fully competent to make financial decisions. The sister received a settlement, a small one. Garrett kept everything. There was more. His older son, Derek, had been subject to a regulatory review by CIR, the Canadian Investment Regulatory Organisation, 3 years earlier over client account management irregularities. The review had been resolved without public sanction, but Derek had left his firm shortly after. Pauline had been involved in a strata dispute in Vancouver, in which she was accused by co-owners of filing misleading documents with the property registry. The matter had been settled privately. Paul looked at me over his coffee. "Ruth, this family has done this before. They look for women who have built something, women who are a little bit lonely, women who won't be suspected of naivety because they seem too smart for it. That's the con. You were the mark." I didn't cry. I'd used up my tears by then, somewhere between reading the spousal interest declaration and getting Paul's first phone call. What I felt instead was something colder and more useful. I felt clear. I went back to Susan. "I want to build a case," I told her. "Not just the divorce. I want fraud. I want the false filings addressed formally. I want this on record." Susan looked at me carefully. "It'll be difficult. It'll be expensive. It might get into the press." "Lakeshore House has a reputation I built over 22 years, I said. "I'm not hiding in my own house." We spent 2 months building the file. Susan brought in a forensic accountant who reviewed every document Garrett had filed. We found 4 separate filings that contained false information about his contribution to and interest in the property. We found emails between Garrett and Derek discussing, directly and without any apparent concern about being found out, how to maximize the asset position before any divorce proceedings and what timeline they needed to achieve threshold influence over the business operations. Threshold influence. Those were the actual words. We also found that Garrett had asked Wesley to build a shadow website, a nearly identical version of the Lakeshore House booking site, that would have redirected guest payments to a separate account. It hadn't launched yet. We found the staging environment. We had screenshots. And we found Garrett's first wife's sister. Her name was Linda, and she lived in Burnaby, and she had been waiting 3 years for someone to call her. I planned the confrontation carefully. I told Garrett I wanted to have a dinner. A proper one. His children, my daughter Claire, a few close friends, to mark our 2nd anniversary at the inn. He was pleased. He suggested inviting his children up from Vancouver and Calgary. Excellent, I said. Please do. The Saturday of the dinner, I had my staff set the dining room beautifully. Candles, the good linens, flowers from the garden. I opened the best bottles from my cellar, the ones I'd been saving. Garrett and his 3 children arrived dressed well and in good spirits. Claire arrived and hugged me tight and said nothing, which was everything. Then my other guests arrived. Susan, my lawyer, with a colleague from her firm. Paul, my investigator. Constable Renaud from the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit, who I'd been in contact with for 6 weeks. And Linda, Garrett's late wife's sister, who had flown in from Burnaby the previous evening and whom I put up in my best guest room. Garrett went white when he saw Linda walk through the dining room door. "What is this?" he said. "This is a dinner," I said. "Please sit down." Constable Renaud introduced herself. Derek pushed back his chair and said this was ridiculous. Wesley looked at his phone. Pauline looked at the door. Nobody left. I stood at the head of my dining room table in my inn, the inn I had built from nothing, the inn that had cost me 22 years and every decision I knew how to make, and I looked at each of them in turn. "You came into my home," I said. "You filed false documents with the county and with the province. You tried to attach a lien to my property. You built a fraudulent booking site to redirect my guests' payments. You did this on purpose, with planning, and you thought I wouldn't notice." Garrett tried to speak. I raised my hand. "Linda flew here from Burnaby to sit at this table," I said. "Her sister spent the last year of her life being maneuvered out of everything she'd built. I know what you did. I know what you did trying to do to me. And so, now, do the police." The constable stepped forward. The fraud charges had been prepared. The false filings with the provincial registry were documented. The shadow website was documented. The emails were documented. Derek was arrested that evening. Pauline was arrested. Garrett was taken separately, given the additional complexity of the spousal relationship and the weight of what we'd found regarding his first wife's estate. Wesley, who had cooperated with us once he understood the full scope of what he'd been pulled into, was cautioned and released pending further proceedings. He sat at my dining room table after everyone else had been taken out, and he cried. I don't know what to do with that. I'm still not sure I forgive him, but I believe he was in over his head. The legal process took nearly a year. Derek and Pauline pleaded guilty to fraud and false filing. They received fines and community service orders, and Derek lost his registration eligibility with CRO permanently. Garrett went to trial. He was convicted of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty within a marriage, and 1 count relating to the exploitation of a dependent adult, his late wife, which the Crown had been building quietly since Linda came forward. He received 4 years. The divorce was finalized before the criminal proceedings ended. The prenup held entirely. Garrett received nothing. His legal costs consumed what savings he had left. The fraudulent filings were struck from the registry. Today, I'm 66 years old. Lakeshore House is in its 23rd year. Claire came back to work with me, not because I asked, but because, she said, watching me fight for what was mine, reminded her of why she'd loved this place her whole life. Rebuilding a small spa addition in the East Fields, the one that looks toward the water. I make every design decision. I sign every permit. I tell this story because people ask me sometimes whether I regret marrying Garrett, whether I think I was foolish, whether I should have known. Here is what I know. I was not foolish. I was lonely, which is a human condition and not a character flaw. I fell for someone who was very good at performing sincerity, because that is what people like in practice. I made one decision that some might call less than fully transparent, letting them believe the ownership was more complicated than it was, and that decision gave me time. Time to watch, time to notice, time to build the evidence that protected everything I had. Protecting yourself is not the same as not trusting someone. It is the recognition that trust is something earned over time, not granted at an altar. That what you have built with your own hands is yours. That no signature, no marriage certificate, No charming smile transfers that. I walked the eastern field last week in the early morning, just as the sun came up over the lake. The frost was still on the ground. The light on the water was exactly what it was when I first stood on that field 22 years ago and decided I was going to make something here. It's still mine. Every room, every stone, every inch of shoreline. I bought it, I built it, I fought for it, and I'm still here. There's a moment I keep coming back to, standing in that east field in the early morning, frost still on the ground, the lake flat and silver, and understanding clearly that everything around me was still there, because at some point I had trusted something quieter than love, the part of me that had been paying attention all along. I think about the cause and effect of it now, the choices that led somewhere and the ones that almost didn't. Garrett didn't walk into my life because I was weak. He walked in because I was human, because I had built a full life and still wanted someone to share it with. And there's no shame in that. But the reason I still have Lakeshore House today isn't luck. It's because 22 years of running a business had taught me to read a room, to notice when a smile doesn't quite reach the eyes, to sit with unease instead of explaining it away. What I've come to understand is that there are three things that actually carry a person through something like this, and none of them are dramatic or loud. The first is integrity, not in the abstract preachy sense, but in the practical sense of knowing what you stand for and refusing to move off it. When Garrett slid those documents across the table and I put the pen down, I wasn't performing strength. I was just being honest with myself about what I'd built and what it meant. That steadiness isn't something you find in a crisis. It's something you've either been practicing for years or you haven't. The second is clear thinking, not cynicism. I want to make that distinction because people sometimes confuse the two. Cynicism would have kept me from marrying at all, kept me rattling alone in a house I'd built for more than one person. Clear thinking is different. It's the ability to hold affection and observation at the same time, to love someone and still notice, to feel the warmth of a relationship and still read the paperwork. I didn't stop trusting people when all of this happened. I just got more precise about what trust actually means, that it's earned in small moments over time, not declared a ceremony. The third is something I don't have a clean word for. It's the thing that kept me going at 5 in the morning with frozen pipes and staff calling in sick and a dining room full of guests expecting breakfast. It's the thing that made me call Paul and then call Susan and then stand at the head of my own dining room table and say out loud what had been done to me. I've heard people call it resilience, but that word has been used so many times it's gone a little flat. What I mean is the refusal to let what you've built be taken without a fight, not from anger, from knowing what the thing cost. Claire told me once, when she was maybe 16 and furious at me for some long-forgotten reason, that I was the most stubborn person she'd ever met. She didn't mean it as a compliment at the time. I took it as one anyway. I'd do that again.